Right. So this afternoon, I'm very, very lucky to have Louis Greenberg. He's not only my editor, but he comes with an extraordinary amount of experience. And Louis has done it all. He started off life as a bookseller. He went on to write novels and short stories. Then he started co-authoring with Sarah Lotz under the name S.L. Gray. He is an editor, a very fine editor, one that I choose to have. And I'm not just saying this to buttering up, but of course I am. He has an MA in vampire fiction, and he has a doctorate in apocalyptic fiction. So when we talk about the end of the world, as we tend to do in this country at the moment all the time, Louis is the go-to guy. All right. He was also a publisher at Ikaya, which in its day was a digital imprint started by Penguin Random House, but the digital idea didn't really catch on all that much. So I think Ikaya went the way of the dinosaurs. But first and foremost, I'd just like to talk to Louis about the whole editing process. So Louis, what is an editor and what is your role as an editor?
Okay, well, there's different stages of editing, which I think all writers should know about. There's the developmental stage where people work with you on your style and expression and the bigger aspects of story and plot, and then so that takes a specific type of editor who will really want to work with you and be quite critical on what's working and what's not. I'm much more sort of, because I'm a writer, I don't like to have my work picked at so much, so I prefer to be a copy editor, which is a much more technical role, which deals with consistency, correctness, things that are wrong. So getting all the spelling correct and all the punctuation and grammar on a line level and a word level. So lots of nitpicking, but generally trusting that the author knows what they want to say, that they've already been through story and plot.
But you also make suggestions and you make comments when you think things are going awry.
You might laugh that I say I'm light-handed, but of course I've always given you 300 or 400 comments per script.
Which is what one wants, surely.
Yeah, everything that seems not to work for the character. The character wouldn't say this or said this 2 pages ago and now saying this, and lots of sort of internal inconsistencies. Basically, reading attentively like your first-time reader would, asking all those questions that your reader would ask and would be confused by, and trying to iron those out before the script actually gets published.
All right. Now, and how do writers, I mean, obviously they all respond differently to this kind of guidance, but I mean, do you come up against, I mean, I know I'm the nicest person in the world, so I don't cause any trouble, but you must come up against the odd one who maybe says, no, I'm not going to listen to you.
Actually not. I mean, I generally find most writers are very happy to have an attentive glance at their book, that they would like to catch mistakes. Because generally what I'm looking at are actual mistakes that are wrong and that they'd like to see before they get published. But if it's a matter of subjectivity, we can always to and fro about it. I say, this person wouldn't say this, and then you can come back to me and have a nice little conversation. There are some editors, I think part of being an editor is learning to both know who you're talking to and know how you can talk to them. Like I can always give you a bit more uphill than I might give a more sensitive writer or someone.
Huge amount of uphill.
And so there's writers who you have to just be a bit more diplomatic with some and couch your queries in a sort of polite way that doesn't seem like you're being attacked. Because also for a first-time writer, often having a screed of notes about their book can make you feel vulnerable. And I mean, even I, in my most recent novel, got a whole lot of editorial comments that made me feel quite hurt, and like I've done all this work and it was just criticism. So I know from both perspectives what it feels like to be edited. So I think you should always try and be sort of polite and friendly. Not like, you don't have to be overly gushing or anything. Your job is to try and fix things, but just say it nicely.
Now, when you get a manuscript, and you work from two different perspectives, you get manuscripts given to you for editing by publishers, and you do individual clients you've got who must come to you for editing.
Yeah.
Are there two different approaches to that?
Yes, publishers generally, because if you're being hired as a copy editor, you know that it's already probably been through a developmental stage, so you trust that the author, that the major issues of plot and character are settled, and you won't focus on those too much unless they are out, like they jump out at you. And then also you can be much more like to the point. You don't have to be couch or tone too much. You can just say technically what's wrong without having to like explain too politely, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because also it's going to the publisher and not directly to the author. I'm not sure. Sometimes the publisher will send it straight to the author without vetting the comments, and other times they'll just select some of those comments and send them to the author. Not always quite sure whether you're speaking directly to the author or to the publisher, who's looking for a much more sort of professional brush up.
Yeah. And when it comes to an individual who's come to you to brush up the manuscript, I mean, is that a harsher edit?
No, well, there I try and explain myself a lot more, explain the rules of language and the rules of storytelling, say more general things about narrative and about how it should work, and especially if they're a first-time writer. Obviously, if they've published several books before, then I'll trust that they're looking more for a solid and maybe a deeper edit. You can always try and gauge the client and see whether they're first time or whether they're very experienced. And sometimes in their brief, they'll ask you to what level they want to do it at.
Yeah. When it comes to the formatting of a manuscript, if you get a manuscript that's not formatted nicely, do you send that back before you do the edit?
No, I generally include a format. I don't spend too much time on getting it ready for an ebook unless I'm briefed to do so. But I'll generally do a format myself.
Wow, but that can be quite a lot of work. I mean, indenting dialogue and paragraphs.
Yeah, it does, but you can set up styles. So if you've got sort of first line, out and full outs and indents and chapter headings and things, it actually helps me just get into a job if I scan through it, just setting all the paragraph styles. And then I get a sense of the structure of the book before I've even started to read it. And like I can, in my mind, I'm starting to see characters and where they are and story points as I go along. So it's a good overview.
But it would be helpful to you as the editor to have something properly formatted when you get it, would it not?
If it's a total mess, then you see probably it's not ready. Yeah, I mean, always I would like to see if it's a total all over the place, then it probably hasn't been worked through. By my stage, I'd like to see your best effort already.
Yes, I mean, that's going to tell you something about the writer. So if the thing is professionally presented, you're in a better position.
And of course, coming from a publisher, then it will have been properly formatted before it gets to me.
Oh, I'm pleased to hear that. And no, you mentioned that you don't do any very robust editing. Have you ever done any where you've had to rewrite whole sections?
No, I just avoid that. Because I'm writing as well, that's a different part of my brain. I can't sort of let them mingle. I can't overwrite for someone else because it takes away from that creative energy that I've got, which is quite limited.
Okay.
I'd rather spend that writing time on my own book.
Okay, so you don't do any ghost writing then?
There are lots of people who are specialists at it. It's a different mind space for me. When I edit, it's very technical and it's all about consistency and correctness and format. And it's a different type of editor, but there are plenty of development editors who will suggest big rewrites and ghost writers.
And the document is probably a Word document. How do you go about signaling the changes that you've made to the author?
There you'll use track changes. Firstly, you'll at least set all of the text on double line spacing so that all the track changes can be visible, because otherwise they all crush together and it's very hard to follow. So double spacing is important, and a decent size font. And then track changes, it's important you track the changes, send them back to the author. They can respond directly on those changes. Every change they make in response should be tracked as well, so that you can have a bit of a to and fro. And then they can accept or overwrite what they don't want.
All right. If they suddenly decide to rewrite a chapter, what happens then?
Well, then you can, I mean, if they do send you something new without tracking, then you can always just run a compare between the two versions, and then that will highlight all of the new material, and then you go through that. But then that's quite difficult, because then it will accept all the previous changes that have been made.
Yeah, and then you accept, once the author has okayed all the changes and all the suggestions, you then go ahead and put them onto the manuscript and accept them.
Well, they will be in the manuscript already, because they've been tracked. Yeah. So then,
but you accept the changes.
Well, I actually leave that phase to the author, really.
Okay.
Mostly my job is just to do all the track changes, and then sometimes, usually they don't even come back to me after that stage. They will take it or leave it. Sometimes they come back for another round or two, depending on what we've agreed.
Okay.
But I would like the author to be in actually have the final blame as well as the final credit for their work, because I don't want to accept all the changes and then they will just publish without having vetted all of them.
All right, and once that editing process is finished and you've been contracted by a publisher in this instance, do you then go back to the publisher with the edited manuscript?
Yes, in the case of the publisher, then I'll send them both the track changes and then a style sheet, which is, I think, an important part of this whole process, is keeping a record of all the spelling choices, the optional hyphenation, the capitalization rules, numbers, times, dates, all of those things, both so that you can keep them consistent within the manuscript, and then also for any further books in the series that you want to keep to the same style. Because editorial things are not always just right or wrong. There's a lot of optional decisions that you need to make along the way, and then you should note them down.
All right. Now, part of the role of the editor is to pick out or to look at instances where an author may have transgressed against sensitivity issues in today's very fraught climate. Do you see that as part of the editor's job?
That is an essential part now. Well, now I'm a member of the Chartered Institute of Editing and Proofreading here in the UK. And that's, you have to sign up to a code, and one of the essential jobs now is sensitivity checking for legalities, for slander, for libel, etc. You have to be aware of those things, and whether or not the publisher wants to publish them or not, or the author wants to publish those or not, you need to highlight them. It is important.
Okay, but would that not have been a part of an editor's job before anyhow?
Yes, it would. It would. I think this has formalized it. I think it was just an eye-opener for me to see that is a formal part of the job, and if you don't do it,
so that's something that they do in the UK. Is it not something done in South Africa?
Not formally. Well, I never was part of a sort of formal body. I just did the work for the publishers and did according to their brief, and their brief generally covers that.
Okay. Does it go further to look at gender issues? Yeah.
The language, inclusivity, equity, it's great. It's nice that these things are being formalized, that you have to look at these things, because you can't just perpetuate stereotypes and damaging language. It's our job to be aware of it. If as an author or publisher you want to then publish that, and if it's legal to do so, then that's your business. But I think we have a progressive duty to highlight those things.
Now, when it's gone through you, is there a need to go to a sensitivity reader as well?
I would say a sensitivity read. I don't think there is, and there isn't in any publisher's process that I've worked in. There are specific sensitivity readers that maybe are engaged if a book is particularly sensitive. And I think that might be more in nonfiction than fiction, because in fiction you have more space to express, and you can have nasty characters who say nasty things, and that's just fine.
Yeah.
Whereas in nonfiction, generally it's a real person expressing those things, and then that's more in the line of legality and sensitivity.
Okay, right. Just on other terms, how long, a 90,000 word manuscript, I mean, how long would that take you to edit? Do you read the thing first of all, beginning to end, and then get down to the editing? Is that how it goes?
Some people do that, but I prefer actually to read as a first-time reader, because those questions will come up in context. Like if you're reading a novel, you'll have the questions in the first chapter without having the benefit of knowing what's going to happen at the end. I want to see that question's answered now or will be answered. So always, if there's something that comes up, I say, will this be answered later? And I highlight that for myself and I come back to it. So I try to edit as I read, discover along the way with the reader. So I'm working as an empathetic reader, I think. In terms of how long it takes, it depends on what condition it's in. If it's been sent to me by a publisher, it's generally been worked through a little bit and the language is fine, and that will take me much less time than a book that maybe the language needs a lot of help on a line-by-line basis. So anything between 1,000 and 3,000 words an hour is my average for a copy edit.
All right, so that's quite fast. My book, that's quite fast.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable.
And how many hours would you spend in a day doing that? Because it's also fairly concentrated work.
It is, yeah. So I can't get more than 4 or 5 hours into a day. And then often there's other things that come up in the week. So I tend to block my work into days and weeks, and so 5 hours times 5, if it's a full working week, 25. Yeah, maybe a novel in about 2 weeks is a good average.
Okay, all right, well, that's fair. And then, without setting monetary figures to this, is it a profession that one can earn a living off?
It's not a very good living. I work very hard. I work full time now in my own work, and I earn less than various other minimum wages. Also, I try very hard to stick to the CEP, the Institute's suggested minimum wages, but never earn them from fiction publishers. For the average going rate for a copy editor here is about maybe 70% of the minimum suggested wage. So really? But there are sort of payoffs as well. I can work for myself, choose work that interests me. And
private clients, I assume you charge more.
You try to. There, I try and go for the minimum wage at least. But it feels unfair, really, that private individuals should be paying more than massive companies that make a lot of money. But that's just the way of the world.
You need to be more of a capitalist. All right, let's. You're an author as well, and you started out being an author before. Or no, you were doing technical editing, weren't you, before your novel was published?
I was always doing a bit of everything. I was at Exclusive Books, being a bookseller, writing my novel on the side, and doing their website. And that's how I branched into publishing, was starting with Umuzi's website. I did it like the moonlight job while I was working at Exclusive Books. And then eventually they gave me my first sort of reader's report and proofread to do, and that's how I branched into editing. But all along I'd been sort of immersed in books and writing content for the Exclusive Books newsletter and so on.
And the first novel, was that the first novel? Was it the first one you'd ever written, or were there a whole pile of drafts of some other novels?
That was the first book I'd written, but I'd also written another one at the same time, which never got published. And then I got another one after that rejected, happily, because it wouldn't have been a great memory.
Okay. And what's happened to them since? Have you burnt them or put them in a drawer?
Yeah, they're just sort of somewhere deep in my files there. In fact, the other one that wasn't published really went through a whole of different, like I kept the kernel of it, and then it turned into my most recent novel, but totally unidentifiable. It was just the soul of it was still in my new book, but nothing else.
But that must be about 15 years later.
Yeah, 20 even.
20. Okay. So what you're saying is that the process is not an easy one where one just sits down and writes a book and gets it published.
Not for me, anyway. I mean, if you talk to Sarah, maybe it's a different story. She's amazing.
No, I don't think it's too much different. But anyway, so it was a battle then. But when your first one came out, it was really well received.
Yeah, to my surprise.
Very gratifying.
And yeah. I think that actually set me up for a lot of disappointment in the whole thing. I thought, this is what happens. You write a novel, you get shortlisted for prizes, you become a literary darling, and this is how it should go on. And then being rejected for my next novel, and then taking ages to get out my other novel, and then as history was going, becoming just irrelevant, and sort of struggling to even find a place. It sort of was a big disappointment that I had to get over. Then I hooked up with Sarah and changed my direction a bit, sort of went commercial and just fun, writing fun horror rather than trying to be a literary voice or anything. And that was great fun, and it lasted a while, but then...
Right, just before we get to Sarah, what you're also saying is that there's a certain amount of determination and you just have to sit it out. You've got to keep writing. You can't take those rejections and let them beat you into the ground.
You have to write what you want to write. You can't write for acclaim, you can't write for money, you can't write for anyone to love you. The best thing you can do is to write a book that you want to write, and that's the only way you're going to live with yourself 20 years down the line. I'm very pleased that that's what I always did, that even if the book failed completely to get an audience or whatever, it's something I wanted to say and the way I wanted to say it at the time. I didn't try and write it for someone else.
Now, why this interest in vampire fiction and then apocalyptic fiction? I mean, what was it that sent you in that direction?
I don't know. I think I've always had a very dark imagination, but because I was brought up as a Catholic and was quite steeped in sort of religious iconography. And at the same time, then the first books I seriously read as a youngster, or maybe 10 or 12, were Ruth Rendell and Poe. And they were just books that sort of sparked some feeling in me, I think. And it didn't really become part of a bigger story or anything, or like I didn't know why I was interested in these things, but only at university when I studied English and then did a course in Victorian Gothic fiction, then it sort of snapped together. I thought, this links into my interests it's like so quasi-religious and so dark, and so it's all about sex and death and love and like things that I think as a kid I was afraid to express or was repressed in me. And so suddenly there was fiction that allowed me to feel and allowed me to explore things that were taboo, and that's great.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, having done the heavy academic work, did that help in creating the fiction?
I think in a way not, but also yes, because at least it exposed me to a whole lot of different voices and books that I didn't know about, and a little bit of a sense of what people were writing. But the actual writing process was very different between academia and fiction. it took me a long time after university to actually feel confident as a fiction writer. They seemed two different worlds altogether.
Which they are. I mean, it's quite a difficult shift to make.
I think if I had got like a comfortable full-time job in academia, I'd still be doing it and probably wouldn't have written fiction at all.
You were lucky they turned you down.
I turned them down. I thought I was.
Sorry, I got the wrong way around. Okay, then let's get to the whole gig with Sarah. Louis writes co-authors novels with Sarah Lotz. Sarah Lotz and I first encountered one another in UCT's creative writing course. And Sarah then wrote a novel which nobody would publish. And eventually Penguin picked it up and they published it. And she went on to write another 2 books for Penguin South Africa, this is. And sort of crime novels, wonderfully written, wonderful books. And I guess they didn't do that well in the South African market. At any rate, she, I don't quite know the story about how she got an agent and the agent suggested a story to her or got her to write a treatment. And the next thing was Sarah was on a trajectory to the stars. And the first book that came out was a book called 3, or The 3 or 3?
The 3.
3. And she's now also left Noordhoek, not far from me, and gone to the UK. And after that, I think the 2 of you met, if I remember the story, in some conference in Joburg. Tell us about that, because I mean, 2 more unlikely people I can't imagine.
Well, actually, it's a bit backwards because Sarah and I met at the conference when she had just had her 3 South African books. She was at a local crime conference, and then we sort of bunked off the afternoon session and we discussed our mutual love of horror. She was interested in my vampire fiction, my vampire masters, and I was interested in her love of zombies, and she was just a fun person to hang out with. So then I just quit my day job at Exclusive Books, and she said, well, why don't we just write a horror novel together? And if it hadn't been for having quit, I would have said no, but we did. So we wrote them all together, and that's where we picked up our agent, who's still her agent, well, still both of our agents. But she, so that's how she did it. And so we wrote them all, and
all right, let's just stop it there. How did you write them all? Who came up with the idea, and how did the whole process unfold?
We both wrote it together. We first wanted to write a vampire versus zombies book, which then we didn't. And then we walked around the mall just sort of chatting. We thought this would be a great setting for a novel, you know, because I'd worked at Exclusive Books. I knew all the back alleys behind the mall, sort of service entrances and so on. And I took her for a little walk. It was in the Hyde Park shopping center. So I took her around the back and she said, this is great. This is perfect location. So we just sat down and wrote it. We had 2 characters who dovetailed. She sent me one chapter in Rhoda's voice. I sent her a chapter back. It's sort of like a game of exquisite corpse, you know, like you write an ending and then the next person has to pick it up. So to just parallel, we'd sit and wait. A few days later, we'd have the new chapter and then just had to write from there. It was such fun. It was like great. It was like something I'd never done. And we just whipped that together, and we messed up a bit because we didn't realize how good it was or how much, because we didn't think, both with our sort of South African experience of publishing where everything just falls into an ocean. The agents were all over each other about it, but only after we had signed it up to Corvus. So we got a tiny little advance and we could have probably got a bidding war, but that's another story. And then, so we wrote a couple of follow-ups to that, the Ward and the New Girl. And that was like the Downside trilogy, we call it. And then we did a couple more books, sort of standalone books, The Apartment and Underground. Underground was like, we liked it, but it wasn't really well received. And the apartment was really boosted by Spielberg optioning it for a film, which he then dropped. But because being optioned by Spielberg was amazing, because all the publishers around the world thought it was going to be the next big thing, and they bought lots of translation rights, even though the film was never made. So that was nice. But that was like a high point in quite a patchy trajectory.
Yeah. But just to get back, so you've got the idea, you've got the two characters, you write first person, both of you.
Mm.
And who wrote the first chapter?
Sarah did.
Okay, then you've got to pick up the story from that chapter.
Yes, from a different character's perspective. So it was really fun because she gives you a bit of the story to go into, and then so I sort of entered it from the side, from his perspective, and then they hook up, and then they go off to the next spot, and then I leave it for Sarah.
And did it ever come back with any surprises in it where you thought, oh hell, what do I do now?
Always. We were trying to trap each other all the time, catch each other out and saying, write your way out of that. We sort of had them hanging on a ladder in the middle of a sewer or something, or being attacked by rats or dolls from the underworld or whatever. It was fun.
So you could kind of end a chapter at a really dire end, and just wait for the other person to pick it up and see what happened.
Yeah, and so we really tested ourselves to write a cliffhanger at every chapter.
But were you working against a plan? Did you have some kind of arc that you were working towards?
No, it was all by the seat of our pants. That was the great thing about it. No one had even bought this novel. No one was expecting it. It was just a fun exercise. So we really could do what we wanted. It was great.
But how did you know when it was going to end? I mean, how did you know where the end was?
Well, actually, it has a sort of fake ending. So they go into this underground mall, and then they sort of have a whole lot of horrors, and then they eventually get out, but then the book's only 50,000 words. So then there's an extra part, like what happens after this terrible situation, which I thought was quite, I think some of the readers enjoyed, because it was like new for a horror to look beyond the end of beyond the escape and what actually happens to you. So our characters were actually found themselves wishing they were back in that situation, because life in the real world is just so boring and mundane, and like it was a parody of like slave capitalism and people working in shops and things, and there they were back in the real world where people are slaves to the corporations again.
And did this in any way hamper your own writing, or did it help, or
It didn't. It really helped, because I mean, I'd written the first book, and then it sort of petered out with lack of interest and lack of time, and this really resuscitated my love of writing. I really enjoyed it, because I wasn't really planning to write another novel. So then it allowed me. Then Sarah, after that, started writing her own solo books, which were doing well. And then so I wanted to try and keep up with her. I wrote a couple of solo books myself, and she also, I had the time, because we were on quite a tight schedule. We used to write a book, I think one book a year when we wrote those first three.
Wow.
Amidst our other work and so on, and also young kids at that time. I had babies. But then so when she started writing her solo books, then I had some time to write. It was quite sustainable for a while to write half the time and freelance half the time.
Yeah. So you were doing a book a year with her.
Yeah.
And clearly your relationship was quite easy going, and you're still talking to one another.
Yes. I mean, I think because our great skill is just writing together. As you say, we're kind of different people. We wouldn't really, I mean, we've never lived in the same city, and now we live in the same country, but we hardly ever visit each other. But what we do love is just writing stories together. We haven't for a while, because she's been so busy, and I've lost a bit of a spark. but she has always been just relaxed to work with them. And very creative.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. Always has been. Will you do another book with her?
I don't know. We're in very different spaces now. If someone asked us and if she had the time and I got the advance, then we would. But it's very hard to make time even now to write.
Yeah. And Louis, what was it like when these books were picked up and suddenly everybody was wanting to option them for movies and so on? I mean, you know, it's a difficult thing to cope with sudden celebrity fame.
Well, there's hardly celebrity. That's the great thing about being a writer. It's not like anyone's going to stop you on the street or anything. But it felt, I mean, I think in another way that sort of made me feel this is how publishing is, and like the next book will always be as successful. And it does set you up for disappointment when it isn't. So it was great to live that bit of success. But things change, and if you're not sort of changing with them, it's hard to keep up. And I think Sarah's done that really well. She's shifted and changed. She writes all the time. She's so disciplined and hardworking. So she's got a new series of rom-coms out, which is doing great, which is so different from her other books. But it takes that sort of energy to be in, like to keep on producing and to keep on being in the public eye. I don't think I have that energy or inclination really.
Yeah. No. It's, I mean, I think it is a matter of individual writers and what they want to do. And she just is this production house.
She's amazing. I mean, she's amazing to work with because she's always got ideas and she voices things amazingly. Her characters are always they sound real.
Yeah. Now, tell us too about how you got from the Wastes of Johannesburg to the UK.
There was this scheme, a talent visa at the time, which I didn't think I had any chance of doing. But already as Sarah had moved here, and we had every intention of writing more books together. Not that I had to be in the same country as her to write, but I just tried out for this talent visa. And I was really surprised to be accepted for it. And I think it's just the success and sort of international reviews that some of the SL Grey things that allowed me to be endorsed for it. Then we ended up arriving here in April of 2016, just before the Brexit vote, and things have changed quite a bit here since then. But the world is changing everywhere. It's not quite the sort of sunny uplands that we're imagining, but it's still fine.
It is good, and I mean, you're working as a creative writing teacher as well, are you not?
Yes, that was great. Richard Denoy, who is he's a Dutch writer, South African. He was on the South African scene. We were friends. He sort of just introduced me to someone who happened to work at the Oxford Continuing Education Department. And just through that, I got a little tutoring gig, which is nice, stable work alongside the other work.
So are you going to stay there? I mean, is this now home?
I think as much as home as my kids are teens now and quite embedded in the society. And for now, it's a comfortable place to be. Okay,
yeah. Well, I mean, we have wonderful things like load shedding and no trains, no post office. I mean, you could some of all this stuff.
I'm very conflicted about everything. One day, I mean, I would write about it, but I don't know if sort of my conflicted views on place and home are particularly interesting to anyone.
No, I think you should. I mean, I think all writers need to leave the country in order to write about it. So we're waiting for that novel. Yeah. Are there any questions for Louis? Because while he's here, now's the time. Beatrice, Louis has experience of the UK. I mean, if you want to ask anything particular, now's the time.
Thank you, Mike. I just wanted to ask if you think it's worth engaging. Is there any help to engaging an editor before you try and pitch it to agents and other people. It just seems to be impossible to get any kind of traction or any kind of feedback that might lead you to a decision in another direction. I think that Mike knows my frustration, which is why he's asked me to raise it.
I think if you've got the money,
can I just come in before you answer? Beatrice has a number of novels which I've watched develop over the years. I actually cannot understand why they have not been picked up for publication. One of them was even set in the UK and came up against some sensitivity issues, which eventually persuaded the agent to turn it down. But it's still a case where I am completely baffled as to why publishers are not looking at her. But I mean, I realize I'm not a publisher, so that's it. Okay, sorry, over to you, just so you had some background.
Yeah, no, in that context, I think there are specialist people who will read from an agent's perspective. It's the reasons why books are accepted are not to do with literary merit or how well it's written or how well it's formatted. It's generally just luck and a sense of what's happening now and what will sell. That's what they're interested in, what will reach an audience. I do some work on a platform called Readsy, which is a whole marketplace of editors who have different specialities. And maybe on there you'll be able to find, or just in general online, you'll be able to find the sort of reader who will read a manuscript with that in mind, whether it's sellable, whether an agent will pick it up. It has nothing to do with your story. It has to do with placement. It has to do with luck. It has to do with the industry. And I hope you already know by now not to take it personally.
Not really.
I don't know. I don't know. I can't tell you what sells and why. But there are some people who are tuned into these things. And then if you have that in mind, and the big problem for writers is that we can't spit out something the next day. So if this person tells you this is what's big at the moment, or this is the sort of thing that will sell, you write it, and then next year it's changed again. So
what was that company you mentioned?
Readsy, Reedsy. So there you sort of bid on freelancers in various types of editors, and there may be some who will specialize, who have worked for companies or agents, and maybe able to advise. Maybe get a reader's report first. Yes, I do some sort of contract out of there sometimes. All
right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beatrice, I think you should try, I really do. And on the non-fiction side?
Yeah, I mean, I find myself editing and then re-editing and then over-editing, and on it goes. You know, it's just an editing process, and then so you kind of wonder, well, how many times is an edit enough? You know, how much is enough to then present it to an editor?
I think you need to let it go at some stage. If you find that you've said what you want to say, then don't worry too much about the sort of expression and the technicalities of it. Obviously get it proofread and sort of polished up before you send it, but don't overdo the content, because if you spend all that time reworking content, you're wasting time on new content. Let something go and then start something else. Is my suggestion. Fiddling with it is not going to essentially make it any more or less sellable.
I find myself completely changing it altogether sometimes.
Then maybe you need to be writing 2 books or different things.
True.
Yeah, but I think you've done all right with that, with the 2 books, so that's fine. Michael is in Ireland. Where would he look for a publisher? Does he go locally to Ireland or to London and find one of the big ones?
I think the UK will cover both regions. I don't think there's much publishing separation between the UK and Ireland.
There
And
isn't.
there's big Irish authors like Marion Keyes, or for instance, are seen as British authors.
Yeah. And the smaller publishing houses in the UK, I mean, are they still flourishing? Or not flourishing?
No, there's mixed reports, because I mean, apparently they're selling more books now than they have in the last 10 years, which is a good sign. Independents, I don't know. Anecdotally, I think some of them have shut down, but others are still going. But I think my sense of the indies is that they're kind of very, very specialized and maybe not looking broadly. But I don't know. I wouldn't be able to say. I think looking at the latest listings, the sort of online equivalent of Writers and Artists Yearbook, and looking at people on Twitter and looking at their companies and seeing what they're doing right now is the best way of approaching it.
Yeah. And Louis, I mean, is the process still the same? Is there still an advance against royalties, or are people just going straight into the royalty business now?
Well, I don't know personally. My last 2 books were sold for a very small advance. And much more people are doing self-publishing, but in a very professional way. So they're indistinguishable from mainstream published books. And that's a good way if you have edited properly and if you design properly. That might be as good as getting lost on a mid-list or a backlist from a big publisher. If you think you've got a really strong book that's going to sell a lot of copies, then pitch it to an agent and a major publisher, I'd say.
But otherwise, self-publishing is actually becoming a doable thing in the UK.
I think so, because a lot of people are investing in it. That's the big difference between commercial publishing, I mean, sort of traditional publishing, and self-publishing is who pays for the proper editorial treatment. So a publisher will pay for your editing and your design and your cover, which makes it worth going for a traditional publisher. But if you're prepared to pay for that yourself, there's no reason now to go through the middleman and give half your 80% of your income to them.
Yeah. What do you do about warehousing and distribution? I mean, that must be an issue still.
Yeah, that's true. I think you can get a lot of print on demand, and there's people who, again, you'll be paying a middleman if you're going to be doing physical copies to distribute them to bookshops, because, as you know, that's a big chunk of the cost.
And do they get reviewed? I mean, that's the other thing. There was always a thing about not reviewing those books.
No one gets reviewed anymore. There's no book pages in the newspapers. There's no book show on the radio, on the BBC. You just have to make a noise on the internet and try and be noisier than the rest of the person. And I think it's just about having a presence. If you don't have that presence, then you're not going to be heard.
Okay, so social media is important then.
Yeah. I mean, I'm saying this from a disappointed writer's perspective. I honestly don't know. There's no mid-list anymore. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. But I mean, you have a website. Do you think it's worth having a website? Well, you've got a whole lot of books to your name, and you work as it's also an advertisement for your work. Is it worth getting a website?
I think so, just as a repository of what you've done, if you want to, but it's not visited very much, but it's like if someone will visit you, it's more for getting work than for actually showcasing the books. And it shows that you have a professional presence. And it's not, you can get a site through Wix that looks very nice, and you can design it with drag and drop and make it look pretty. And that's not that expensive.
Louis has a website. It's well worth going and having a look at it, because it's nice and clean, and it's got all his stuff on it. And I mean, I was quite impressed by how clean it was. It's very easy to navigate one's way around it, but then one would expect that as an editor, would one not?
No, I'm glad you saw the new site, because it had been years and years since I've been wanting to overhaul my site. So I made it cleaner.
Louis, I think that's brought us to the end. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's much appreciated. As I said, I will put this up on YouTube, and I'm sure the other students will have a look for it. And if anybody wants creative writing advice, which you pay for, then Louis is your guy.
Great.
And if anyone wants to just drop in a question related to this, please do just email me. I'll be happy and won't even charge per hour.
All right. Louis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thanks,
you.
to everyone.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Bye.
this. Very good. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.